She swept her porch every single Saturday evening. She walked to the same church every Sunday morning at 6 o'clock sharp. She worked the same job for 30 years. Paid every bill on time. Kept her house so clean you could eat off the floor. She was the kind of woman who never gave anyone a reason to worry about her. And on a quiet Saturday afternoon in September of 1964, a stranger knocked on her door and she let him in. By the time anyone thought to check on her, Katherine Blackburn had been beaten, stabbed, and mutilated with heated kitchen knives inside her own home. Her killer walked out into the sunlight and disappeared for 61 years. This is the story of how a single piece of cloth tucked underneath a dead woman's body and forgotten for over 6 decades finally gave a family the answer they had been waiting their entire lives to hear. Welcome to Midnight Crime. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the bell notification, because we cover the cases that refuse to stay buried. Like this video if you are ready to hear the full story. And stay with me because this one goes deep. Katherine Beck was born on the 1st of March, 1914, in Albany, New York. Her parents were Polish immigrants, and she was raised in a household where the Catholic faith was not simply a tradition, it was the foundation of everything. She had 1 brother and 5 sisters, and from the time she was old enough to understand the world, Kate understood that faith meant sacrifice. It meant keeping your word even when it cost you. It meant honoring your promises even when the person you made them to had long since stopped caring. Everyone called her Kate. And Kate, at just 24 years old, made a decision that would quietly shape the rest of her life in ways she could never have anticipated. On the 3rd of July, 1938, she married a man named Jesse Blackburn. The wedding was not in a church. It was at City Hall. Jesse had been married before, and under the laws of the Catholic Church, that meant a church wedding was out of the question. It was a compromise and Kate felt it the moment she made it. Jesse served in the United States Army Air Corps, which meant constant movement. New bases on the West Coast. Overseas deployments. Always somewhere else, always somewhere new. Kate didn't want to follow him. She didn't want to leave Albany, and she didn't want to leave her sisters. The two of them wrote letters back and forth, and those letters made one thing painfully clear: these two people were fundamentally incompatible. Kate was responsible, organized, and principled. Jesse was unreliable, careless, and always broke. They stopped living together after only a short time. Jesse eventually settled in Japan. Kate stayed in Albany. But here is the part that matters: Kate never divorced him. She couldn't bring herself to do it. In her mind, divorce was a sin. She had stood before God and made a vow, and no matter what Jesse did or didn't do, she intended to honor that vow. So they lived completely separate lives. He was in Japan. She was in Albany. And technically, on paper, they were still husband and wife. Kate poured herself into her work. She spent 30 years at the Mohawk Brush Company, starting on the factory floor and working her way up to forewoman. She was dependable. She was trusted. She was the kind of person a company builds itself around. Jesse would occasionally send a letter. Sometimes his girlfriends would write to Kate as well. And when Jesse needed money, which was often, Kate would wire it to him. Not because she was foolish. Because that is simply who she was. Loyal to a fault, and bound by principles even when those principles asked more of her than they should have. But Kate had a secret. A secret she had been carrying for years, hidden from the family she loved more than anything in the world. Her family would not find out until the day of her funeral. We will get there. But first, you need to understand the life she was living in the summer of 1964, because that life, that routine, that apartment, that one decision to advertise a vacancy in the local paper is what put her directly in the path of a predator. By 1964, Kate was 50 years old. She lived alone in a 2-family house she owned at 117 Colony Street in Albany, in a working-class neighborhood in the north end of the city. The house was well kept. Pink and white petunias lined the window box out front. She rented the upstairs apartment to tenants as a way of bringing in extra income, and she took that responsibility seriously, just like she took every other responsibility in her life seriously. Her neighbors could practically tell the time by watching Kate's routine. Saturday evenings, she swept the porch. Sunday mornings at 6 o'clock, she walked to Mass at St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Church. Weekday mornings, her friend Marie Hogan would pull up out front, and Kate would come outside to ride with her to work at the brush factory. That routine was not just habit. It was identity. It was who Kate Blackburn was. And when that routine suddenly broke, when the porch stayed unswept, when the car waited outside and nobody came out, that is when the people who loved her knew that something had gone terribly, terribly wrong. On Saturday, the 12th of September, 1964, Kate worked a half-day at the factory and came home around noon. Her longtime tenants upstairs had recently moved out following a death in their family, which meant the upper apartment was empty. Kate had been running an advertisement in the local paper since July, looking for a new tenant. The ad had run for the last time on the 4th of September, just 8 days before. She had told people she found someone. A short man in his 50s. He had paid a $10 deposit and was supposed to move in on the 1st of October, him and his mother, he had said. But something about this man had been gnawing at Kate from the moment she met him. The address he gave her was 369 2nd Avenue, a nicer part of Albany. Kate's neighborhood was solidly working class. Why would someone move from a better area into hers? It didn't make sense. On top of that, when the man had come to view the apartment, Kate noticed he smelled of alcohol. She was uneasy. Unsettled in a way she couldn't quite explain, but couldn't ignore either. She was worried enough that just 3 days before her death, on the evening of Wednesday the 9th of September, she asked someone to drive her over to the address the man had given her. She wanted to see it for herself. She wanted to know it was real. Now who she asked to drive her is connected directly to the secret she had been keeping from her family, but we are not there yet. They drove to 2nd Avenue that night. The address was a real street. But it was too dark to identify which specific house was number 369. They turned around and went home. Kate never got her answer. 3 days later, she was dead. Between 5 and 6 o'clock on Saturday the 12th, her neighbors watched her do what she always did: sweep the front porch. It was ordinary. It was Kate. It was the last time anyone outside that house would see Katherine Blackburn alive. A short time after that, she spoke to one of her sisters on the phone. Her sister offered to come over with food for dinner. Kate said no. She told her a tenant was coming to see the apartment. That phone call was the last time anyone heard Kate's voice. Between 5 and 6 o'clock on Saturday the 12th, her neighbors watched her do what she always did: sweep the front porch. It was ordinary. It was Kate. It was the last. Sunday morning came, and Kate did not show up for the 6 o'clock Mass at St. Joseph's. She was not at the 8 o'clock Mass either. For a woman who had never once missed church, this was not just unusual, it was alarming. Neighbors noticed she hadn't come outside to hang her laundry or burn her trash, 2 things she did every single Sunday without fail. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. And yet nobody checked on her. Monday morning arrived. Marie Hogan pulled up to 117 Colony Street for their daily carpool. Kate did not come outside. Marie knocked on the door. No answer. Now genuinely frightened, Marie called Kate's 19-year-old niece, Sandy. Sandy had a little time before work that morning, so she went to check on her aunt. She knocked on the front door. No answer. She threw pebbles at the windows, hoping to get Kate's attention. Nothing. They found the cellar door unlocked and entered through the basement. When they came up the stairs into the shared foyer, Kate's apartment door was unlocked. They went inside. The first floor was empty. Kate wasn't there. Kate had mentioned she had been painting the upstairs apartment to get it ready for the new tenant. So Sandy and her Aunt Anna headed up the stairs. The front door of the upper unit was open. And there, on the floor of the living room, was Kate. Sandy, just 19 years old, ran to call an ambulance. When the paramedics arrived, they took one look and did not try to save her. They called the police instead. Katherine Blackburn had been murdered. What investigators discovered inside that house was one of the most disturbing crime scenes in Albany's history. And what made it even more chilling was not the violence itself, it was the calculation behind it. This was not a crime of sudden rage, of someone losing control in a terrible moment. This was slow. This was methodical. This was a man who took his time, who used Kate's own home as his instrument, who treated every step of what he did as though he had done it before and planned to do it again. Kate's body was found in the upstairs living room, but that was not where the attack began. Blood evidence showed the assault started in the entryway between the upstairs kitchen and the back bedroom. Kate had brought the man upstairs to show him the apartment. At some point, likely while she went downstairs to retrieve the keys from a lockbox in her bedroom, the killer picked up a small hammer or a meat tenderizer from her kitchen. Without her knowing. When they were upstairs together, he struck Kate on the back of her head. Multiple times. Hard enough to fracture her skull. Some of her fingers were broken. She had instinctively reached for the back of her head after the first blow, and her fingers were caught by the strike that followed. Think about that. Kate's last conscious act was reaching back to protect herself. She collapsed face down on the floor. The killer walked downstairs. He went calmly into Kate's kitchen, selected a knife from her own block, brought it back upstairs, and turned Kate onto her back. He stabbed her once on the left side of her neck, and once more at the front of her throat. That second wound severed her carotid artery. Katherine Blackburn bled to death on the floor of the apartment she was trying to rent out. And then the killer kept going. He went back downstairs. He broke open a cedar hope chest and pulled out a white linen sheet. He took pillows from Kate's bed. He dragged her body from the kitchen into the living room and attempted to clean the massive pool of blood. But there was too much of it. He eventually gave up and dropped the soaked sheet near the stain. That blood seeped through the floorboards and down into Kate's own apartment below. He pushed her dress up around her neck. He cut away her clothing. And then, because the upstairs apartment had no electricity, he went back down to Kate's kitchen, placed her own kitchen knives directly over the burner flames of her gas stove, and waited. He waited for the blades to get hot enough to burn skin. Then he carried them back upstairs. He made that trip multiple times. Knife after knife. He used those heated blades to sear intricate shapes and patterns onto Kate's body. He took his time with it. When he was done, he hid the knives under the stove cover. He sexually assaulted her. He left behind biological evidence that, in 1964, investigators had no way to make use of. And then, before he walked out the door, he did one final thing. He found Kate's rent receipt book in the living room hutch. Every time a tenant paid rent or a deposit, Kate would fill out a receipt, one copy for the tenant, one stub remaining in the book. The killer tore out the last written page and 4 pages behind it, removing every stub that might have carried his name. He was cutting the only written thread that connected him to this house. But he didn't know something. When you press hard enough on paper, you leave impressions on the sheets beneath. Those torn-out pages were gone. But the pages underneath still carried the faint ghost of Kate's handwriting. And those impressions held a name. A name that would eventually send investigators across state lines, through decades of dead ends, and ultimately into a cemetery. If you are still watching at this point, drop the word "still" here in the comments right now. This story is just getting to the part where everything changes, and I want to know who is truly writing this case out with me. Drop it below. Still here. Let's see who is paying attention. Now remember the secret Kate had been keeping from her family. The secret that had been locked away for 16 years, hidden from the sisters she adored and the nieces she quietly loved from a careful distance. More than 1,000 people attended Kate Blackburn's funeral at St. Joseph's Church. 11 of her co-workers from the Mohawk Brush Company served as pallbearers. The entire factory shut down for the day so everyone could be there. Detectives stood across the street and studied every face in that crowd. They had wired Kate's casket with a microphone, hoping the killer might lean in close and whisper something, a prayer, a confession, anything at all. He didn't. But the family learned something that day that none of them had known before. Kate had been in a relationship. A real relationship, for 16 years. His name was Ben Masson, a produce seller who had survived polio. He could still walk, but only with great difficulty. He lived with his mother. And according to everyone who knew them, he had loved Kate deeply and quietly for the better part of 2 decades. Kate never told her family about Ben. Not once. She was still technically married to Jesse. In her faith, being romantically involved with another man was a sin. But divorcing Jesse was also a sin. She was caught in an impossible space between 2 principles, and rather than face the judgment of the family she cherished more than anything, she chose silence. There was another layer to it as well. Kate was Polish and Catholic. Ben was Jewish. In Albany in the 1960s, that combination still drew stares and whispers. Kate knew that. But she found small, quiet ways to let her 2 worlds touch without ever allowing them to collide. When her niece Sandy was working at a local ice cream stand, Kate and Ben would park far enough away that no one would recognize them together. Then Kate would send Ben up to the counter just so he could meet Sandy. Just so the 2 people she loved most could be in the same place at the same time, even if neither of them knew it. Sandy had no idea who he was. She thought he was just a customer. Ben told police that on Saturday night he had driven to Kate's house, but she didn't answer. He came back Sunday. Nothing. He called approximately 10 times between Saturday and Monday. He never saw her alive again. Ben cooperated fully with every part of the investigation. He was not a suspect. He was simply a man who had loved someone in secret for 16 years and had no way of knowing, in those hours of silence, that she was already gone. After the burial, Sandy and her cousin Teresa went back to 117 Colony Street. They were barely 20 years old. And they did something no person that young should ever have to do. They cleaned their aunt's blood off the apartment floor, not because anyone asked them to, not because it was their responsibility, but because they couldn't stand the thought of their mothers walking in and seeing it. The investigation that followed was enormous in scope. Detectives chased leads across multiple states. They looked seriously at Albert DeSalvo, the Boston Strangler, whose pattern of targeting women alone in their apartments had chilling parallels. They investigated a convicted killer from nearby Amsterdam named Lemuel Smith, who was known for sexually assaulting and mutilating his victims. Neither man was connected to Kate's murder. The one concrete lead they had was the name pressed into the pages of the rent receipt book. The impression analysis pointed to the name Robert Broadhead or something close to it. Experts agreed on the first name, Robert. The surname was harder. Broadhead. Brandstead. The address: 369 2nd Avenue. Police tracked down every man with a matching name in Albany. They checked the residence of 369 2nd Avenue. They checked houses numbered 369 on other streets in the city. Every single lead collapsed into nothing. The name was false. The address led nowhere. And the killer, methodical, patient, calculated, had walked away clean. One detective, however, refused to accept that. Lieutenant Edmund Flint, known to everyone as Ted, kept Kate's file on the very top of his cold case stack for years. It was the case that weighed on him more than any other in his career. He worked it through the end of his professional life, and when he finally retired, he passed the file on. And then Ted Flint died without ever knowing who killed Katherine Blackburn. Days became months. Months became years. Years became decades. Kate's house was eventually demolished. The neighborhood changed around it. The detectives who had stood in that upstairs apartment and looked at what was done to Kate, they grew old. Some of them died. But they never stopped talking about her. And neither did Sandy. In August of 2018, a detective named Melissa Morey was working in the Albany Police Department's Forensic Investigation Bureau. Her husband had come home from a gathering of retired detectives. They had spent the evening talking about the cases that haunted them. For many of those old officers, when that question came up, the answer was always the same. Kate Blackburn. Something clicked for Melissa when she heard that. She knew the department still held evidence from old cases, she just didn't know what was there. She pulled Kate's file. And what she found stopped her cold. The evidence from 1964 was all still there. Every piece of it. Kate's clothing. The sheets. The knives. The handkerchief recovered from underneath Kate's body. Everything preserved and intact after more than 50 years. Those original detectives, men working in a time before DNA was even a concept, before forensic science had developed the tools to make use of biological evidence, had worn gloves at the crime scene. They had bagged and labeled everything with extraordinary care. They didn't know why they were saving it. They just knew that someday, someone might need it. They left a gift for the future. And they never knew if anyone would open it. And then Melissa discovered something that felt less like coincidence and more like design. Kate's niece Sandy, the same Sandy who had found Kate's body at 19 years old, who had cleaned her aunt's blood off the floor, who had spent the next 5 decades carrying that mourning inside her, lived on the same street as Melissa. They were neighbors. Sandy had complimented Melissa's dog on their walks. Melissa had no idea that this kind, elderly woman had spent her entire adult life waiting for someone to answer a question. That same November, a professor named Dr. Christina Lane launched the Cold Case Analysis Center at the College of St. Rose in Albany. Sandy, now in her 70s, saw the news coverage. And she did what she had been doing since she was 19 years old. She reached out. She asked if someone could help. The center contacted the Albany Police Department. Melissa Morey was assigned to lead the reinvestigation. Over the next several years, Melissa and Dr. Lane pursued every possible avenue for re-examining the evidence. They hit walls. They were told no over and over again. Options didn't pan out. Leads went cold before they could be warmed up. Melissa would later describe working a cold case as being like a long research project, long stretches of absolutely nothing, one piece of bad news after another, rejection after rejection. But they found the right piece of evidence. And eventually, they found the right lab. The key, as it had always been, was the handkerchief. That single piece of cloth, recovered from underneath Kate's body in 1964 and preserved for over half a century in an evidence room, was about to change everything. In 2023, the Albany Police Department partnered with Othram, a forensic DNA company based in Texas. A non-profit organization called Season of Justice provided a grant to fund the testing. Othram used a specialized sterile wet vacuum system to extract DNA from the porous fibers of that 60-year-old cloth. Working with forensic-grade genome sequencing, they built a comprehensive DNA profile from what they found. That profile was handed to the FBI. The FBI's genetic genealogy team ran the profile against publicly available genealogy databases, the same technique that had been used to identify the Golden State Killer. What came back were not matches to the killer himself. They were matches to his relatives. People who shared his bloodline. Working backward through family trees and cross-referencing those trees with historical records, investigators gradually narrowed their focus to one man. A man who had died in 1998. A man who had never once been looked at as a suspect in Kate's murder. Police reached out to his surviving family members. They cooperated fully. They provided DNA samples willingly. The results confirmed that investigators were following the right thread. But confirmation through relatives was not enough. They needed absolute, irrefutable proof. They needed a direct match. On the morning of the 15th of September, 2025, 61 years and one single day after Kate's body was discovered, investigators gathered at Albany Rural Cemetery. They had a court order in hand. They opened a grave. They extracted samples from a femur and an arm bone, sealed them, and sent them to the laboratory. Weeks later, the results came back. It was a match. On the 8th of October, 2025, Albany Police Chief Brendan Cox stood at a podium and spoke a name aloud for the first time in connection with the murder of Katherine Blackburn. Joseph Stanley Nosikowski. Born in Albany. August, 1931. 33 years old when he murdered Kate. Dead since 1998. And his criminal history, once investigators pulled it together, painted a portrait of exactly the kind of man he was. At 18 years old, he was arrested for 3 separate burglaries. After leaving the army, he was arrested at Union Station carrying a suitcase that contained a loaded pistol, switchblade knives, a crowbar, skeleton keys, handcuffs, glass cutters, and something perhaps more telling than any of the weapons, detailed floor plans of private homes across multiple cities, along with newspaper clippings that tracked when wealthy families were scheduled to leave on vacation. This was not a petty criminal. This was a patient, organized predator who studied his targets before he moved on them. 9 years after Kate's murder, in 1973, a 74-year-old woman in Schenectady woke up in her bed covered in blood. She had been attacked with a hatchet while she slept. Fractured skull. She lived alone. The attacker left behind a gold dental crown and a single glove at the scene. 5 days after that attack, Nosikowski crashed his car while drunk. Police found a blood-stained hatchet inside the vehicle. The dental crown matched his teeth. The glove matched the crime scene. He pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 3 to 15 years in prison and released in 1980. After that, he disappeared from the public record. He died in 1998. And for the next 27 years after his death, he remained completely unconnected to the murder of Katherine Blackburn until a handkerchief and a DNA laboratory finally said what the evidence had been quietly whispering for 6 decades. At the press conference, Sandy Carmichael stepped up to the microphone. She was 81 years old. She had been 19 years old the morning she walked up those stairs and found her aunt on that floor. 61 years of carrying that image. 61 years of not knowing. 61 years of picking up the phone and asking one more time, reaching out to one more person, hoping that maybe this time someone would finally give her an answer. She said that 61 years ago, evil had entered her aunt's house and changed their lives forever. She said they had prayed for this day. She thanked every single person who had made it possible. Kate's other niece, Mary Ann, stepped forward and asked a question that silenced the entire room. "Do you believe in miracles?" She said her family had received one. Police Chief Cox told everyone gathered in that room something that felt like both a declaration and a promise. He said, "There is no such thing as a cold case. Here is what stays with me when I think about Katherine Blackburn. It is not the brutality of what was done to her, as horrific as that was. It is not even the technical marvel of extracting a usable DNA profile from a 60-year-old piece of cloth. What stays with me is the chain of human beings who refused, at every stage, to let Kate become a forgotten name in a box on a forgotten shelf. The detectives in 1964 who put on gloves and bagged every piece of evidence with extraordinary care, even though they had no technology to use it. Ted Flint, who kept her file on the top of his stack every single day until the day he retired, who died still thinking about her. Melissa Morey, who heard a group of old detectives talking about a case at a party and thought, I can do something with this. Dr. Lane, who built an academic center around the belief that victims who have been forgotten still deserve answers. The scientists who pulled a DNA profile out of 60-year-old fabric and turned it into a name. And Sandy, who was 19 years old when she walked into that apartment, who cleaned her aunt's blood from the floor so her mother would not have to see it, who never stopped asking, who picked up the phone one more time in her 70s, and who was 81 years old when the answer she had spent her entire life waiting for finally arrived. Kate Blackburn lived by her principles, even when those principles trapped her. She went to church when it was easy and when it was not. She stayed married to a man she did not love because she believed her vow was sacred. She kept the man she did love a secret because she could not bear to disappoint the family that meant everything to her. She opened her door to a stranger on a Saturday afternoon because she was a landlord trying to rent an apartment. That is all. That is the whole of it. And for that, she paid with her life. Joseph Nosikowski died in 1998 without ever sitting in a courtroom. Without ever facing a jury. Without ever being made to answer for what he did to Kate, or what he did to that elderly woman in Schenectady, or whatever else he may have done in the years between. In every conventional sense of the word, he escaped justice. But he did not escape the truth. Because 61 years after he walked out of that house, his bones were pulled from the ground. His name was spoken in front of a room full of cameras and reporters and the family of the woman he murdered. Not as a man. As a monster. And somewhere in that room, an 81-year-old woman who had spent every decade of her adult life waiting for that moment finally exhaled. Kate was laid to rest at St. Agnes Cemetery in 1964. Nosikowski was buried at Albany Rural Cemetery just a few miles away. The victim and the man who destroyed her, separated by a short drive and 6 decades of silence. That silence is over. If this story reached you the way it reached me, I want you to do something right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear Kate's name. Leave a comment below telling me what part of this case hit you hardest. Was it the handkerchief? Was it Sandy? Was it the fact that this man died in his bed, free, in 1998? Tell me. And if you are not subscribed to Midnight Crime yet, now is the time. Hit that subscribe button and turn on every notification, because we cover the cases that refuse to stay buried, and we are just getting started. Kate Blackburn deserved better than what happened to her. The least we can do is make sure the world knows her name.